This is Research Like a Pro, episode 260, Shipindex with Peter McCracken. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com. Break down genealogy brick walls with a subscription to the largest online newspaper archive. Hi everyone, welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi Nicole, how are you today?
I'm great, Mom. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. What have you been working on?
I've been adding some things to my timeline for the Dyer project, and I discovered this couple in Granger County, Tennessee, who have a lot of descendants who are DNA matches to the Dyer descendants. So I've been doing some research on them, forming a timeline about them. It's James Dyer and his wife Beddy, spelled B-E-D-E-Y or Biddy. So I'm thinking her name is short for obedience, possibly. Anyway, I've been kind of finding them in census records from the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s, and then their children all seem to have gotten married in that county, in Granger County. So that's what I have so far in my timeline. And one thing that's been really fascinating is seeing a common surname among a neighbor. And the objective of my project is to find the parents of my husband's ancestor, John Robert Dyer. And one of his associates had the surname McKinney. And this James Dyer and his wife Betty, they also lived near John A. McKinney in Granger County, which neighbors on John Robert Dyer's county, Hawkins County. So I am really intrigued by this McKinney connection, and I'm hoping that it will turn out to be something useful.
Nice. Sounds like you're making good progress on that.
Slowly.
Every little bit is progress. That's awesome. Well, let's do some announcements. We have our Airtable Quick Reference Guide for sale on PDF on our website. And for our Research Like a Pro webinar series, for the month of July, we have an exciting webinar that will be presented by our team member, Alice Childs. And the title of this one is, Who Are the Parents of David R. Matheson, a DNA Case Study? And the description lets you know a little bit about what this will be about in the localities. David R. Matheson emigrated from Nova Scotia to California as a young adult, where he later married, had 2 children, and died young at the age of 42. Documents created through David's life in California fail to identify the names of his parents. This case study will discuss how following the Research Like a Pro DNA process helped identify David's ancestral family, identify and eliminate paternal candidates, and solidify biological relationships to both parents. So this was really fun. I worked on this with Alice, and there were a lot of Mathesons in Nova Scotia. And it was really interesting seeing how the DNA and the documentary work helped to finally separate them out and hone in on the correct father. So, anytime you're dealing with same name people or multiple people that could be candidates, it's so interesting to hear how you can actually figure that out. So it's going to be a great webinar.
Great.
And we have our Research Like a Pro study group beginning this fall, and registration is ongoing. So if you've been thinking about that, hop on the website, check it out, see if you're interested in joining with us from the end of August into November. And if you're interested in being a peer group leader, we'd love to have you apply. All of that you can find on our website. And please join our newsletter to get coupons and get the latest news.
Well, today we're excited to have a guest. His name is Peter McCracken, and he has been an electronic resources librarian at Cornell University since 2016. And prior to joining Cornell, Peter worked as a reference librarian at East Carolina University and the University of Washington. In 2000, he co-founded Serials Solution, which was acquired by ProQuest in 2004. In 2009, he co-founded Shipindex.org, which helps people do research on vessels. Peter received the Ulrich Serials Librarianship Award in 2011 for his work with Serials Solutions, and was honored with a Distinguished Alumni Award from UNC School of Information and Library Science in 2012. He has published scholarly and non scholarly articles in many journals and wrote a quarterly column titled Maritime History on the Internet in Sea History magazine from 2004 to 2020. Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming.
Hello, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, we're so excited to learn more about this. That's what we love about doing genealogy and family history is there's always more to learn. And this is a subject that I'm excited to ask you questions about and have you really give us an insider's look at how we could use this database, shipindex.org, that you've developed to further our research. So let's just start with that. What is Shipindex?
Shipindex is a database. It tells you what books, magazines, websites, databases, or other resources, whatever there might be out there, tells you which of those resources mention the vessels that you want to learn more about. So it says, hey, this book or this database or this magazine, they mention this particular vessel. Its real focus is maritime history, and maritime history is something that I care deeply about, but that's very applicable in genealogy research as well.
Absolutely, because if we're here in the States, our people all came over usually on a ship until the days of airplanes, right? And so often we have those, and we have those in our own family history, the names of the ship that came over. And sometimes I can find a little bit online about those, but I am guessing that Shipindex helps you dig much deeper in getting into some of those published sources that maybe just don't pop up in a Google search.
Yeah. And it will guide you to many resources that you wouldn't otherwise find because they're really not in genealogy. That's not where they expect to find them. Another area that I think is really valuable for genealogists is if you know that someone served on a merchant vessel or a naval vessel during a war or they were at sea or something. Maybe you know that they were on board from this date to that date, and you'd like to learn more about what their experience was. Even if you don't find a mention of that person, you can find out what happened on board that vessel. And since you know that they were on board at that time, you know that they were experiencing that as well. So it's another way of learning a bit more about the experiences they had. Also, people, if they want to add leaves to the tree, say add a picture of the ship that their ancestors, their grandparents went on a honeymoon on, say you're putting together stuff, a booklet, and you'd like to have a little bit more information, that might be a useful photograph to add just on the side.
That's great. Those are some fun examples.
I've had some remarkable experiences at genealogy conferences. I was at a conference in Cincinnati, and a man came up to me and he kind of barked the name of a ship at me. And I looked in the database and in 2 or 3 seconds, click, click, and there's a picture of this vessel. And he said, "Oh my goodness, that's the ship that I came to America on when I was 4 years old."
Oh,
And he ran off to get his wife and he brought her back and he pulled out his camera. This was 10, 12 years ago. And he was taking a picture of the screen. So I had to take a picture of him taking a picture of the screen because I thought it was very funny. And of course, I gave him the information that we found there. But that sort of thing is really interesting and exciting.
Wow, that is really exciting. I love that. I've seen in family trees where people will have pictures of the ships that their ancestors sailed on as like their profile picture or just one of the gallery pictures in the family tree. And so I think that's one of the things that Chip Index can help us with is finding those pictures. Tell us more about where those pictures are coming from in the database.
For pictures of ships now, especially in the 19th century, the 18th century, it can be very hard to find illustrations of specific vessels. I just don't think that they exist very often. But when they do, we can help you find them because I take the indexes to books, for example. And if that index indicates that a particular page has an illustration of a vessel, or passenger lists or crew lists for a vessel, we note that. And so in the database, you can limit to results that have illustrations or results that have passenger or crew lists as well.
That's great. So I think now would be a good time to tell us more about how we can access Ship Index. Is it available for all? Is there a cost involved? Where would we go to find it and that sort of thing?
So I started this as a project when I was working as a reference librarian at the University of Washington. And I didn't have any intention of making it into a business. And so I got the URL shipindex.org, and I didn't bother to get the .com at any point. So everything that I put in at that time, plus some extra citations, are all in a completely free part of the database. You don't have to register to use that. It's just 150 or 160,000 citations that are totally freely accessible. Everything that I've added since I, with my brother, decided to create an actual company out of it, they are all in the subscription database, which now has over 3.2 million citations in it. And people can subscribe for either a set period of time that's costs $6 for 2 weeks of access, up to $65 for a year of access, or a monthly recurring at $8 a month. So I don't believe that it's very expensive, and I think that it's a unique tool for finding information that you just wouldn't be able to find otherwise.
Fantastic. It definitely sounds like it would be a time saver for research of this sort and help you get the information more quickly.
Yes, I think that there are lots of resources that genealogists wouldn't know about otherwise. You might find we have all these resources from the Navy Records Society, which has been publishing primary documents in British naval history for, I think, 120 years or so. Well, what if you find a mention of a vessel that an ancestor sailed on or served on? You wouldn't, of course, normally go through all the Navy Records Society volumes looking for these things, but Shipindex can help you discover that those citations might actually exist.
Yeah, that's so true. You wouldn't know to look there unless you had done extensive research into what resources are available about ships. And it sounds like you've done that work for us.
I would like to think so. Yeah.
Well, I'm just looking, I am signed on as a guest and looking at some of those 150,000 citations. So I thought I'd just read a couple for our listeners so they get an idea of what this is. When you say citations, well, what does that mean? So, for instance, we have the first one, and there's a little box that tells you whether it's on the web, it's from a journal, it's a book. It kind of tells you the type of source. Then you have the title. So this one says 1881 British Census Crew and Passengers on Ships Arriving in New South Wales. And then that's on Find My Past. And then there's a little orange underneath that, another orange box that says resource requires subscription, because Find My Past is a subscription website. But then you have a direct link to go there. So that's really neat that we have so much information on that just from your citation. And then some of the others, reference, again, more Find My Past. But I think this is really fascinating. This one is a journal article for the American Neptune. So I'm assuming that's a journal, 1941 to 1990. And it's published in Salem, Massachusetts, and part of the Peabody Essex Museum, I'm guessing. So that would definitely be something that we probably would never think to go look at to find out more information. So interesting.
Yes, there's all sorts of great stuff in there. One of the first resources that I added was this one called Merchant Sail by, I think it's William Fairburn. And he wrote this 6 or 7 volume history of Atlantic American and Atlantic Canadian maritime history. And then he just mailed these volumes to libraries around the country in the 1940s or 1950s, I believe. And the last volume is an incredible index to the whole thing. And that whole volume is or the index to the resource is in the free database. And when the book is available in Google Books or HathiTrust, we have links directly to the page actually in question. So you can find information from Starbucks, History of American Whale Fishery, for example. And then another part that is in the free citation are subject headings from WorldCat, the directory of library holdings in the US and around the world. And that can be really incredible. It can be very difficult, and they've made some significant modifications that make it a bit more challenging now. But it is possible that one could discover a handwritten journal that was written by someone who was on the same emigration voyage as one's ancestor. I mean, imagine, even if they don't mention your ancestor in their journal of the voyage, but imagine if they do, that would be incredible. Again, they're telling you what your ancestor experienced on that voyage. it's a really interesting connection that informs your understanding of your ancestors' experiences, even if it doesn't mention them by name.
Absolutely. And we talk about that all the time. I love to use county histories in the United States for the same exact reason. You learn all
Mm-hmm.
about the community. So this is just another way to add to their experience, their community. So looking at the website, we don't search by people on this. We search for the ship. So first we have to have done some research to know the name of the ship, or perhaps narrowed down some of the ships that they could have been on. Is that how you would approach some research like this if you maybe didn't know the name of the ship?
Yeah, there's no way that I could compete with the amazing, really large collections that exist out there from Find My Past and My Heritage and Ancestry and all of those. But that, in fact, is not really my interest. My interest is making vessels more visible, right? Making
Right.
maritime history research easier to do. And if you have a mention of the ship that an ancestor emigrated on and you know the name of it, then we can help you learn more about it.
Great.
It's not the first place you're going to go, of course, but when you want to learn more about your ancestors' experiences, it can provide connections that I believe you wouldn't find any other way.
Perfect. Well, this is your life work. You know this better than anyone, and I'm sure you've just made so many interesting discoveries. So I'm excited about this. I have several ancestors on my whole maternal line. My mom's side came over in the 1850s, 1860s, and I'm pretty sure we know the names of the ships that they came on because they did leave written histories. So I'm going to have to use one of those and see what I can discover more. The interesting thing I found is that the ship's passenger list, which I'm kind of assuming would be the correct name of the ship, doesn't really always agree with what's in the history, which is always kind of funny. That how did the name of that ship get changed so much, you know? So,
I've found some really interesting experiences exactly in that, in working through collections of records for immigrants traveling to Australia. There are folks who have done a lot of transcriptions of handwritten documents for Australian voyages, and I collected all of that information and I was preparing to put it into the database, and I would find, this ship name doesn't exist anywhere else. I wonder if this is really correct. But oh, look, the captain's name is similar with another one and the tonnage is the same. And I can feel pretty certain that the transcribed name of the vessel is not correct. And when I go look at the PDF of the document, I say, oh, I can completely see why the transcriber wrote down what they wrote, because it was handwritten and they understandably misread that. But because I have this larger set of data about the whole collection there, I can say, in that case, I believe that they made a mistake. And so I make a correction in the entry, although I keep the old name just in case I wasn't correct. Or if you had information, I mean, it can be useful because you discover, oh, this is a common misspelling of this particular vessel name. But it's one of those places where the aggregate data actually makes it possible to correct individual errors and make that more discoverable, and it makes it more accurate.
nice. It's all about being a good researcher, looking at the details, doing some correlation there.
Well, Mom, I've done some research on our ancestor, Sarah Jane Miller, who came across in 1856 from Liverpool. And the ship that she was on is called the Enoch train. And so I typed that into shipindex.org, and it came up with a long list of citations to different books and things. It has some that are free to look at and some that you need to subscribe to view. And one of the results is leading to an encyclopedia. It says Ships of the World, a historical encyclopedia, published in 1997. So that's neat. So now what I would do is go find this book in the library or find it on Amazon. It's great that there's a link to do both of those things. Either find it in the library, find it at Abe Books, find it at Amazon. Then I can access the resource and learn more about the Enoch train. So that's kind of an example of how you might use the database.
And I'm just looking at the Enoch train as well right now, and I followed the link to WorldCat, and it shows some entries, sailors' accounts with Benjamin Thompson, ship Enoch train 1872 to 1873. And this was a voyage that traveled to Hong Kong and Manila, and I believe it was a little bit later than you mentioned. But here's one particular resource that's held at Bowling Green State University. Let's see, I guess I could follow the link and learn a little bit about it from the Bowling Green entry. But there we could discover, oh, this is great links here. And here's another Enoch Train link from WorldCat as well, a logbook from 1873 and some others from earlier as well.
Oh, fantastic. I haven't explored WorldCat very much, but this is such a great additional website, the Shipindex, and it's great that you link to it from Shipindex. And, I'm seeing some books in WorldCat relating to the Enoch train that are about my ancestor's pioneer journey. She was in the handcart companies of 1856 after several of these people. There was a big group of them that came over together on the Enoch train, and then they completed their journey to Utah using the handcarts. So this is neat to see some books here about them. Cool.
Yeah, I think definitely find some resources here. I'm getting distracted by them, in fact, by what I'm saying.
Are we going down a rabbit hole here?
Yes. It's too fun.
Yeah, it is. It's always exciting to discover something new, a new place to look. Understandable.
Right. And the historical context is so valuable to understand what it was like for them to be on the ship and how the journey was and some of those resources. In fact, when I was writing a narrative about Sarah Jane Miller, I did have access to a diary of another person on the ship, and it was just wonderful to see what that journey was like for her, and the fact that they all coordinated cleaning schedules of different parts of the ship and had broken up into different wards in order to eat dinner at certain times. And it just really shed some light onto what that would have been like on the journey.
Right. Well, one of these articles about the Enoch train is in that same journal that I mentioned earlier, the American Neptune, and looking at it on WorldCat, I see it. There's a copy several places near me at Brigham Young University's library, University of Utah library, and the Family Search Library. So I could easily access that journal and see what article was written about it. That would be so fun.
Yeah, American Neptune was unfortunately it's no longer published, but it was the premier journal of American maritime history. And as you noted, it came from Peabody Essex Museum in Salem.
Very interesting. And see, this is a journal that we haven't heard of. Now we know something new.
Cool. Well, let's take a break to hear a word from our sponsors, newspapers.com. Did your ancestor disappear from vital records? Maybe they moved or got married. Newspapers.com can help you find them and tell their stories. Or have you ever had trouble figuring out how people tie into your family tree? Newspapers are filled with birth notices, marriage announcements, and obituaries. Items like these are a great resource for determining family relationships. On newspapers.com, you can explore more than 800 million newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, and beyond in just seconds. Their easy-to-use search feature lets you filter your results by date, location, a specific paper, and more. When you find something interesting, the newspapers.com clipping tool makes it a snap to share it with family and friends. You can even save it directly to your ancestry tree. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering new subscribers 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription, so you can start exploring today. Just use the code FamilyLocket at checkout. Well, Peter, I'm kind of curious, how did you get the idea to even start up Shipindex?
Well, I've always been interested in maritime history, perhaps a result of growing up in Seattle. And when I was in library school at the University of North Carolina, I spent the summer between my 2 years of library school working at the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, Maine. And as I worked through archives there, I wanted to learn a bit about the Sewell ships of steel that I was doing research on. And I'd have to go and look book by book in the Maritime Museum's library. And at the time, the library itself was a closed stacks collection. So visitors to the library couldn't go through those books themselves. And of course, it's a wonderful library, but it doesn't have everything. And so there are many other books that aren't in that collection. And I thought there must be some directory, some way of finding which books mention which vessels. When I couldn't find that, I started creating it myself. A year or two later, I was working in the archives at East Carolina University, where I was working on a second master's in maritime history, and I read this handwritten journal by these two characters who walked from Virginia to Alabama in the winter of 1890, and then in the spring of 1820, they sailed down to New Orleans, and they sailed on, I don't know, it was the General Butler or something like that. And I thought again to myself, how can I find out about that ship, about this unknown vessel? It's not a Titanic, it's not a Constitution or anything like that. And those were the ideas that got me started on creating what became Shipindex.
I love that story because it really highlights when we need something that doesn't exist. It's time to make it ourselves, right?
That is exactly right. Well, you mentioned, really developing this interest in maritime history from your years in Seattle and then on the East Coast as well. And I'm just curious, what was it that just drew you to that? Do you have any family history of people serving in the Navy or just the love of the ships, the water?
I love the idea of the space of the ocean in a way. I mean, the sense that it is the ultimate interdisciplinary topic. And in fact, it often gets ignored as a result. But that space between places is so critical. And also, it has had such an enormous impact on human history. Of course, anybody who's traveling long distance, the vast majority of people who are traveling long distances before the development of airplanes went by sea. And even long after airplanes became common, it was still a very common way for people to travel by sea. My stepfather traveled from England to Australia and from England to the United States by sea. So that's not that long ago. And then, of course, it remains an incredibly effective way of transporting goods as well, up rivers and across oceans too, as well. And just water, generally speaking, has been a critical part of American and world history. And the whole culture that goes along with it is also, I think, very, very interesting. So it always had this pull for me that I can't totally explain, but I've been lucky enough to be able to have the opportunity to do a lot of research in the area and continue studying it whenever possible.
That's so fascinating. And I love what you said about the water, that so much happened on the water. You think of all the great naval battles throughout history, and I think of my own dad who was in the Navy and sailed from San Francisco to Guam on to China after, the bombs had been dropped in Japan. So he never saw active duty, but he saw that part of the world through a ship. And it really is fascinating to think about how important these ships have been in transporting people all over the world. So, wow, it's
Yes, absolutely.
really opening our eyes to, some new possibilities for research.
Well, tell us, Peter, have you researched your ancestors and learned about any of their ships and immigration?
I haven't done a lot of research in my own genealogy. My grandmother was a librarian, as was her sister, and when I was probably 10 or 11, I flew out to visit her and my grandfather in Oklahoma City, and we spent a week doing a bunch of genealogy then, and I collected all that information, and whenever she would come out to Seattle, we would go to places to do research at the Mormon church in Seattle, which had a large library there. So there is a lot that I have, and I have a lot of the family's papers now. I know that ancestors Thomas and Thomasina Hale married in the 1660s in London and then ended up in Newburyport, Massachusetts a few years later. So there's a great example of where I could start it. Although that 1660s is pretty hard to identify what vessel they might have sailed on to come to America then.
Huh. That is quite a long time ago, but I wonder if there's some article in some journal somewhere that would talk about ships sailing at that time period since it was such a founding era of the country.
Yeah, one thing that I often like to talk about when thinking about how one does maritime history research or really any kind of historical research is to think about who was keeping records and what did they do with those records. And of course, with Castle Garden and Ellis Island in the United States, that's when we started keeping a lot of records. Prior, of course, there were records kept by various custom houses and things of the sort, but going back even further, if nobody felt a need to actually record the arrival of individuals, it might not have been written down exactly what vessel they arrived on, for example. But I think the idea of thinking, okay, who might have written this down and then what might have happened to those records is a really good way of trying to think about where to start doing that kind of research.
That is such a good concept.
Yeah, I love that idea of who would have written it down. Why did people care about this record? And just learning about that, learning about the record keeping of the era, that could really help you. So interesting. And then branching out, like we've talked about the histories. Could there be a county history? Could there be a history of the area that maybe names the ship that some of these immigrants came on? There's so many different avenues that sometimes we don't think about in our research. So it's always good to broaden our mind a bit. So what about ships of the same name? Do we run into that with the database in this type of research?
We absolutely do.
Okay.
And it was a real challenge early on for me to try to figure out what to do here. With the Enoch train example that we were looking at, just looking over these notes, this is not a vessel that I knew anything about, but there's clearly, there was the 19th century immigrant vessel, and then there was a Liberty ship that was built during World War II with the same name. That's obviously not the same vessel. We see a couple of different ships at different times. There was one out of Glasgow in 1874, it looks like, although that might have been the first Enoch train. So, and then when you look at other vessels, you find, many more examples. There have been, I think, 8 different USS Wasps, for example. Recently, I was looking at, in response to a message from a subscriber, I was looking at the Alabama, and there's USS Alabamas, and there's CSS Alabama, and there are many others. And when you look at a woman's name, for example, Sarah or Mary or Marianne or Elizabeth, you find so many vessels with those names. It becomes a real challenge. What we have done in Shipindex is we've said, okay, how can we differentiate between these ships that have the same name? The way we do that is we use a Wikidata identifier. Everybody's familiar with Wikipedia, which has these written encyclopedia entries in multiple languages. And of course, a Wikipedia entry in English is very different from a Wikipedia entry on the same topic in French or in Chinese or in Spanish or in Thai or any other language. They're not translations of each other. As I understand it, the folks at the Wikimedia Foundation said, okay, well, we need some way of tying these things together. Also, a database would be really useful in a lot of different ways. And so what they've done is they've created these Q identifiers, and they can represent a person or a place or a concept or a ship. And so each one is unique. So if you look up USS Constitution in Wikidata, or if you could start a Wikipedia, and there's a link to the Wikidata entry as well, you will find this one Q identifier that represents all of the different versions of that particular ship and links to all the different language entries for that. So the point is that there are multiple Q identifiers, basically one for each hull, for everyone that is named Wasp or Elizabeth or whatever, wherever there are one for each one that is represented in Wikipedia. And so we use that Wikidata identifier to differentiate between the various hulls that have the same name, say. What we do then is we have staff who are doing this. So it's complicated, it's a little bit tedious, and it takes a lot of work, but we say, oh, I can tell from this citation that it is referring to this specific USS Alabama, say, or the CSS Alabama, for example. And then we connect those together. So if you go to the entry for WASP, you'll find multiple different sort of cards, one for each of those vessels. Plus, you'll find many citations below where we don't know which vessel it refers to. Now, we're never going to get all of these citations linked to particular vessels because in a lot of cases we won't know. The citation just doesn't tell us enough information to get a sense of when this vessel sailed and how it might be similar to or different from a different vessel. But for the ones that matter, so for Enoch train, this I can see we can create in some links there for records for other ones. And you can also record changes in the names for ships as well. And so if you do look at Enoch train in Shipindex, you see, well, wait, there's a ship CSS Manassas. Well, it turns out that the Enoch train was a river towboat that was converted into the Confederate gunboat Manassas. And that's not immediately obvious. And so we have connected some of these Enoch train entries into this to this one about the Manassas. And so that brings these together as well. It's a complicated, as I said, a bit tedious project to keep connecting these, but it makes it easier for people to differentiate between vessels that have the same name.
Very interesting. Well, I was noticing in my family tree, my very earliest ancestor, Thomas Royston, came over in the 1600s and actually does have the name of a ship. So it says it's 1635, and these names are to be transported to Virginia, embarked in the Elizabeth Delow Christopher Brown. So, of course, looking up Elizabeth, there's like a lot of ships named Elizabeth. So that might be one that would take some work to find if there was even anything written beyond that, because that is so early. But I love that there is something that we can do to try to differentiate between these vessels of the same name.
Yeah.
That's neat.
I think Elizabeth might be the second, have the second largest number of citations in the database. So
yeah,
that's
kind of could have been because of that queen.
But then you can also look and see very clearly, say there's a schooner noted in the directory of 1869. Well, that's clearly not the vessel that you're interested in. So you just move along to, or tugboats from 19th or 20th century. That's not the one you want, but others might be.
Right.
Well, Peter, what ideas do you have for the future regarding Shipindex and other ideas?
The thing that I've been trying for years, actually, is to figure out a way of identifying vessels that are in large sets of unindexed data. So far, I've always been using indexes to books or journals, or essentially, a web page is kind of like the information can be collected as an index. But imagine all of the vessels that are mentioned in newspapers. There's so many in there. And I've been trying, I'm on probably project number 4 or so of trying to find a way of identifying all the ships that are in there. I mean, if you know what ship you're looking for, well, it makes sense to go to a newspaper resource like newspapers.com, say, and to search for that ship name in that database. But I'm trying to put together an index for people who don't know where to start searching, I guess. So I'd love to find a way to locate all of those. And what I'm doing right now is I'm working with some entrepreneurs who are using AI, ChatGPT, to try to identify vessels. And it is turning out to be pretty challenging.
Oh.
If you see Cleveland, are you talking about the city in the U.S. or the city in the U.K., or even if you're in the U.S. or in Ohio or in Tennessee or where? Or are you talking about the president, or are you talking about a ship with that name? And so trying to teach a computer how to figure those out and then identify all the ships in that large set of data is a real challenge. And that is the area where I feel like if I could make it work, we could unlock enormous amounts of really useful, valuable information for folks. Imagine if you had this list of all of the vessels that are mentioned in, the entire run of a particular newspaper. Given how many newspapers there are, it could be hugely valuable for researchers. So that's something that I've been working on many different ways, and my hope was that this new AI and ChatGPT would make that work. We'll see. The jury's still out on that, I'm afraid.
Wow. I hope that it does help, and it would be wonderful to have access to more, like you said, unindexed collections that mention ships like newspapers and things.
Yeah.
I agree.
Another area that I would highlight is that similar but separate, one thing that I've been working on recently on the Shipindex webpage is research help videos and a more comprehensive guide to doing maritime history research. So actually saying, even though this content isn't yet in Shipindex, saying, hey, here are some newspaper collections that you should try to search. And if you don't have access to them, here are some ways to find out how you can get access to them. And then once you do have access to them, here's some ways to search for, say, ships named Elizabeth, where you're trying to find vessels, not people, and provide some of my library skills to go with my maritime history background and make it easier for people to do that maritime history research.
I think that's wonderful. And I'm just looking at shipindex.org where you've got the research help section where you will start putting in some of these things. Because whenever we go to a new website, we are always kind of wondering how best to use this. And especially this is kind of a new avenue of research for genealogists. So I think that will be really valuable. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out exactly how best to build this. It's something I'm working on. I suppose I'm always open to people's ideas about better ways of making it work. And, folks can contact me at comments@shipindex.org. I'm always happy to hear from listeners.
That's great. Well, our show notes for this episode will have contact information for you and a link to your website. And it's such a catchy name. I mean, who can forget that? Shipindex.org. That's pretty easy to remember. So that'll be great. Well, thanks so much, Peter, for coming on and talking all about Shipindex.org and maritime history and how we can use that to further our research. It's been such a pleasure. Good luck with everything that you're doing.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome. Well, we hope everyone has a good week, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.